Fairy is the best type in competitive Pokemon. There are some other types you could make a case for, but Fairy has been incredibly consistent and powerful ever since its introduction in Generation 6. In Gen 9, when the new Terastallize mechanic was introduced, allowing Pokemon to transform into any type they want, we really saw just how good and desirable Fairy typing is. The number one type that most Pokemon will choose to transform into is Fairy. So many Pokemon desperately wish they were Fairy types. Fairy was introduced late into the franchise as a response to how powerful Dragon types were becoming. This new type had a complete immunity to Dragon type attacks, which was an absolute game changer. The previously spammable Dragon type was now a liability to lock into. Choice Band Outrage or Choice Specs Dracometeor are no longer completely safe to click. Dragon immunity is fantastic, since Dragon types tend to be really strong and rise to the top of competitive. While Fairy only has 3 resistances, these are 3 fantastic ones to Dark, Fighting, and Bug. Dark has been perhaps the most common offensive type since Gen 6, following the buff to Knockoff and the nerf to Steel types, who no longer resisted Dark anymore. So Dark resistance comes in handy all the time, as does Fighting resistance, a very common offensive stab and coverage type. Bug resistance is nice too, with the prominence of U-turn in competitive singles as a pivoting move, and the occasional bug type threats seen from time to time. Fairy has only 2 weaknesses to Steel and Poison, which are extremely manageable and easily covered by teammates. And these 2 types aren't particularly common offensive. The main reason these 2 types rose up so much in usage is because they hit Fairy types. With only 2 very easy to cover weaknesses, Fairy is a fantastic neutral defensive type. Fairy is also quite good offensively, dealing super effective damage to Dark, Fighting, and Dragon types. This combination of great defensive and offensive advantages is hard to beat, and even a simple mono Fairy typing tends to be really strong and consistent. Let's explore all the examples of relevant Fairy types in competitive singles, ever since its introduction in Gen 6. But first, an update. Reports have indicated that Horsey has used the move Bubble Beam as a first strike against Makago in their 1v1 battle at the Trident. It is not known what happened next. Urgently subscribe to the channel so that we may uncover the earth-shattering results of the most important battle in our collective lifetimes. Thank you. In Generation 6, the Fairy type was born, and they made an interesting choice to retroactively make certain Pokemon Fairy types that were different types previously, the most notable of which was definitely Clefable, who was converted from a normal type to a Fairy type, and people would quickly discover that this was a massive buff. Normal typing has its problems, doesn't have any resistances, it's weak to fighting. Fairy, on the other hand, has that wonderful Dragon immunity, those incredible resistances to Dark and Fighting, which come up all the time, generally good neutral defensive typing, and even Fairy Stab coming in handy all the time too. Moonblast is an all-new Fairy type special attack, introduced in Gen 6, and this is just a really solid attack. 95 power, 100 accuracy, and a really good secondary effect, 30% chance to lower special attack by 1. This saves your life much more than you would expect. What's interesting about Clefable is that its stats are not very good, but you don't need stats to be good all the time. With such a great mono Fairy typing, the ability Magic Guard, which is an outstanding ability, granting a complete immunity to all indirect damage, status, hazards, Leech Seed, whatever you can imagine. Clefable sidesteps all of that. And just a truly wonderful move pool. Offensive options, defensive options, utility options. You have immediate healing in Soft Boiled, or Wish if you prefer to provide your team with healing. You have Stealth Rock. I don't know why, but you do. You can make the best hazard in the game with this thing. You have Thunder Wave for a fantastic status ailment to apply. You have Knockoff, which now doubles as Dark coverage. Not that you have a very high attack stat, mostly used here for item removal, which is really strong, of course. And you have Calm Mind, you can be a win condition on Clefable. You also have every coverage move you could ever desire in your heart's dreams, with Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, Stab, a Moonblast usually does the trick, but you know, against the Steel types that resist Fairy, you have Flamethrower, because of course you do. Clefable gets it all. One of the most solid Pokemon of all time, has remained OU generation to generation, and in Gen 9 it is still really solid. Despite losing some of these options, it just has so much going for it, doesn't it? The perfect example of the idea that stats are not always everything. Clefable is blessed in every other regard besides stats, and that all adds up to a truly fantastic competitive Pokemon. Mega Diancie, on the other hand, does have some stats. I mean, look at this. 160 attack and special attack, as well as 110 speed, and really good defenses too. This is a stats machine. and blessed with a fairy typing. I will say that rock typing is not the world's best secondary type for Diancie, but this is more of an offensive Pokemon anyway, and you really appreciate the rock stab on Diamond Storm. Fairy gives you some defensive entry points with its valuable resistances and immunities. Offensive Pokemon always appreciate fairy typing for that reason. Allows them to hit the field in more situations. Stab Moonblast goes crazy. And you also, upon Mega Evolving, gain Magic Bounce, which is a really excellent ability. Bouncing back various advantageous effects to the enemy, most notably hazards, so the enemy is scared to ever create hazards when you have a Mega Diancie on your field. But it also bounces back status ailments, Leech Seed, Taunt, Roar. Most status moves, really, just get bounced back to the enemy. This is kind of a ridiculous Pokemon. This guy is very blessed with truly outstanding stats, ability, good enough typing. The typing fits the Pokemon well, and really good move pool too, with options like Earth Power for coverage, really great stab options for its 2 types here. And we have Calm Mind if you want. Protect is common because it allows you the free turn required to Mega Evolve safely, which is often necessary, but you have other options like Calm Mind to boost yourself up. Randomly has Heal Bell for utility. I don't know if that's something you would see too often. And a lot of coverage has Stealth Rock as well if you create hazards with it. An extremely blessed Pokemon, and one of the best Pokemon in Gen 6 and 7 OU. Azumarill is yet another retroactive fairy. They granted this guy a secondary fairy typing when it was previously just a mono water type. And water is an outstanding type on its own, but water fairy is a monstrous combination. Fairy is pretty much a net gain overall. You get some weaknesses to poison. You're neutral to steel though, so that's okay. But a poison weakness is nothing compared to the advantages you gain. Dark resistance, fighting resistance, dragon immunity allow you so many more entry points, which is what Azumarill wants. It is a breaker with huge power, allowing it to achieve absurd attack stat. Despite having low base attack, doubling your attack, including EVs, just has multiplicative value, turning Azumarill into an extremely powerful wall breaker with a choice band equipped. Stab Fairy really comes in handy. Great offensive type too. It's crazy how good Fairy is both offensively and defensively, truly. Has Aqua Jet for priority. Has good coverage with superpower. And you can also run a Belly Drum set, which uses Azumarill more as a win condition. With a Citrus Berry, you will at least get a bit of healing after halving your own HP with Belly Drum. And it's a bit easier to pull this off now because of the defensive benefits of fairy typing. You have more, not only ways to hit the field, but more opportunities to resist incoming attacks and allow you that health required to get the belly drum off and start clicking moves. And of course, Azumarill was blessed with knockoff too. Gaining fairy typing on Azumarill was a true blessing in every way. Gardevoir was also converted from a simple psychic monotype to a psychic fairy type. Once again, much better than just a mono psychic type. Cancelling out dark weakness, you're now neutral to dark. And on top of this, Mega Gardevoir exists now. Gardevoir got a pretty fantastic Mega form. A lot of the Mega forms are blessed with great stats, but 165 special attack is particularly excellent, especially with this ability right here, Pixelate, which converts all normal type moves into fairy type moves and also buffs their damage. So Hyper Voice becomes fairy type and it has a power of something like 110. Because it's a sound move, it also goes through Substitute, which comes up a lot and is really useful. This makes Gardevoir, or Mega Gardevoir, one of the best breakers in Gen 6. With a great combination of bulk and offensive pressure that it provides to a team. There is a lot of competition for the Mega slot, which you of course can only have one Mega Evolution per game, so there's that to consider with Mega Gardevoir. Mega Metagross is often more desirable. Mega Diancie as well has you kinda beat in many areas. Not as good defensively with the rock typing having a lot of shortcomings, but Magic Bounce provides a lot, and mixed coverage provides a lot, and you're a bit faster on Mega Diancie, which is very important. So, probably the biggest competitor for Mega Gardevoir is Mega Diancie, who is similar offensively, but a bit more versatile, a bit more useful, generally. But Mega Gardevoir is certainly a relevant presence you see quite often. Mega Altaria is another one of my favorite Mega forms. The base form of Altaria is still just a Dragon Flying type like it used to be, but the Mega form is Dragon Fairy, which is a really good type combination. Instead of being weak to Dragon, like Dragon types usually are, weak to themselves, you're now immune. Cancelling out an immunity is always really good, and especially when you can Mega Evolve into that and dodge an incoming Dragon type attack against base Altaria, that comes in handy a lot. Also has Pixelate, but Mega Altaria more of a physical attacker, finally taking advantage of Dragon Dance, which normal Altaria can't really. This has way better offensive stats. Pretty modest stats for a Mega form, actually. We just saw Mega Gardevoir with 165 special attack. These are good stats, but compared to other Mega forms, they're not that crazy. But with the excellence of its typing, the power of its ability, and a pretty good move pool too, Return becomes Fairy type and has a boost in damage, which hits really hard. This is a pretty solid sweeper. It's ranked to UUBL, so not OU by usage, but I actually think it's quite solid in the Gen 6 OU metagame. Fairy Ground is good coverage too, because Ground will hit Steel types that resist Fairy. Roost is nice for healing. Solid Pokemon. Slurpuff is also noteworthy, I think, ranked to UUBL in Gen 6. Can be a pretty scary Pokemon. Similar to Clefable in that it's a mono Fairy type that doesn't look that good at a glance with pretty average stats, but just like Clefable, has a lot of benefits to being a mono Fairy type and has a good offensive move pool and a great ability. Unburden is a rare ability, but it's one of the best offensive abilities you can get, doubling your speed whenever you lose a held item. So with Citrus Berry, you can Belly Drum and do a combo where after consuming Citrus Berry, which not only heals you a bit, making up for the damage you take from Belly Drum, also activates Unburden, granting you double speed, kind of like a Belly Drum plus Dragon Dance at the same time, but it's even better than Dragon Dance. And from there you have an enormous attack stat, even though you're only base 80. Belly Drum maxes your attack, and then you outrun everything with Play Rough. You have Drain Punch, which is decent coverage to hit steals and also heal you back a little bit. And Return is good too. This is good alongside Light Screen and Reflect setters to help you take incoming damage a bit better and Belly Drum more consistently. Not a bad option on Hyper Offense. I think it's decent. I think Slurpuff also gets... I didn't get Sticky Web yet. I think later generation it would get Sticky Web, which was valuable utility for it. Interesting Pokemon, little cake guy, but probably not intended to be any good, but it's just a Fairy type, so we know that Fairy type is broken. And this is a great example of such. Not that it's OU or too relevant, but it's usable. It's got some stuff. It's decent. And Klefki deserves a shout out too, a Steel Fairy type, which is just truly excellent typing. I made the argument that this is the best type combination in Pokemon, at least that we've seen. Just so many immunities, resistances, such defensive value on this. And Klefki, once again, stats are really average, but the typing is just so good. As is the ability, Prankster, granting priority to non-attacking moves. And the utility move pool is really good too, with Spikes, which you can set with priority, which is really strong. Thunder Wave is really nice with priority too, crippling something. Magnet Rise helps you live an incoming ground type attack. You get temporary ground immunity, which patches up like your main weakness. And Play Rough just to hit stuff. You also get the screens, Reflect and Light Screen, if you want to go Light Clay on this, and use it as a hyper offense guy who can not only set screens, but paralyze something, which helps out your threats, or create spikes, which also helps out. Not a bad Pokemon, even though it's UU. You could use this in OU. It's got genuine merit. Plus, it's car keys. That's fun. I like it all around. I think it's cool. And of course, in the generation that introduced the Fairy type, it's only fitting to create a Fairy type box legendary. Just a simple mono-type legendary would be one of the best that we've seen in a long time. Xerneas is infamous in Gen 6 Ubers for being insanely powerful, with mono Fairy typing obviously having a lot of defensive benefits. The ability Fairy Aura granting even further Fairy type damage as you do, and excellent stats across the board. Now, this is the big one here though, is this move right here, Geomancy. It's a charge move that raises your special attack, speed, and special defense by 2, but it takes 2 turns. It's kind of like Fly, where you fly up first and then you attack. This one has to charge up and then you get the boost. But with the Power Herb item, you can skip the charging and just immediately get the boost at the cost of consuming your Power Herb, which is well worth it. And then Geomancy turns you into an insane threat. It's like Shell Smash without any of the downside, and you get special defense as well. It's one of the best boosting moves the franchise has ever seen, and this is an ever-present and central threat in Gen 6 Ubers that you need some sort of answer for. If you don't have a check for this, it will just eat you alive. In one turn of setup, it becomes faster than everything with great coverage. Thunder is used because Kyogre is common, Kyogre Primal specifically. And you could just one-shot that with Thunder, and it has coverage benefits too, hitting stuff like Ho-Oh, which would resist Fairy. And Focus Blast is also good to hit steel types that resist Fairy. At least Xerneas exists in the same generation as Groudon Primal, and yes, his name is Groudon, who is Ground Fire type, resisting Fairy, immune to the Thunder coverage, shrugging off Focus Blast well enough. So Groudon Primal is actually a good check to Xerneas, and Groudon Primal is extremely common. It's on every team, just about. So that's keeping Xerneas in check a little bit, but still insanely central and powerful legendary Pokemon that is top tier in every single generation it's present. There's more than just the Power Herb set too. It's a good Pokemon besides this. You can go with a Choice Scarf set. Some players don't want to go all in on the Power Herb win condition because it can only work once. You can only Geomancer once per game. Sometimes you want to get a bit more value out of the Xerneas, not relying specifically on that. With a Choice Scarf, you have a set like this that just comes in and clicks attacks. It still hits really hard. It's a bit of speed control for boosters, like Mega Salamence and stuff like that. Sleep Talk comes in handy for coming in on Smeargle or whatever sleep user exists. Darkrai, if that's around. I believe you also get Aromatherapy for utility, which you can chuck on here, which is quite nice. Defog too. Or was that next gen it got Defog? I think it gets Defog, but that might be a Gen 7 scenario. Yeah, so it's not all just the Geomancy set. Even though that's the most popular and most infamous, Xerneas is pretty versatile in what it can do. And a regular old Mega Evolution of a previously underwhelming Pokemon, Mawile, also got banned to Ubers in Generation 6. Base form Mawile now became Steel Fairy instead of just Steel, a significant buff, and the Mega form is the same, a Steel Fairy typing. And it gains huge power when it Mega Evolves, which is really, really strong, one of the best offensive abilities you can get. And unlike Azumarill, who gets great benefit from this ability despite not having much of an attack stat, Mega Mawile here has an attack stat of 105. Double this and you reach absurd levels of attack. Your bulk isn't even that bad either, with a solid defense stat. In the previous base form, you also have Intimidate, which effectively grants you a bit more bulk, weakening whatever you come in against, allowing a nice opportunity for you to Mega Evolve safely. One of the most useful abilities you can have pre-Mega is Intimidate. And yeah, this was a really overwhelming threat. It even has Swords Dance to become more powerful, and Sucker Punch to overcome its most glaring weakness, which is this 50 speed, really slow, but with Sucker Punch and such a high attack stat. Swords Dance, solid bulk from its typing and pretty respectable stats. It's easy to see why this was overwhelming Gen 6. It would be unbanned in Gen 7 though, well not unbanned, but just allowed. I suppose because the power level was higher overall, and new Pokemon were introduced that could handle it a bit better. But some people still thought Mega Mawile was quite a dominant presence even in Gen 7, so there you go. In Gen 7, we've got so many fairy types to talk about here, so many OU ranked fairy types, it's unbelievable. And Magearna would be probably the most powerful of them all, definitely the most powerful of them all. With that outstanding Steel Fairy typing, really, really good stats too. I mean, look at this, truly something. And the ability Soul Heart, also excellent, raising your special attack by 1 stage whenever another Pokemon faints. And that's important text right there. You think of Moxie, you have to directly KO the Pokemon yourself with an attack. But this is if they faint to spikes, or poison, or anything. If you attack them and KO them, or if they faint to anything at all, you get the Soul Heart boost, which does come up often. If they want to sack something to hazards, they can't. If they want to fall to poison to try and avoid the Moxie boost, sometimes players will do that. Try to die to poison instead of a hit, so you don't give them Moxie. That's not going to help against Soul Heart. And Magearna has such set variety. The most common set I used to use was Assault Vest, just because it felt really solid against a lot of attackers. Anti-Greninja, Anti-Tapu Lele, and Mega Alakazam, which were really, really strong. And from there you can pivot out, or just hit him with big damage. Floor Cannon, even though you're completely specially defensive invested, Floor Cannon has 130 power. It's a bit like a Draco Meteor Fairy type version, which comes in handy all the time as a big neutral hit against incoming ground types or whatever. But this was a really, really consistent and strong set, but you could also just go fully aggressive with this against Shift Gear, which raises speed by 2 and attack by 1. The attack boost is irrelevant because you're mostly a special attacker. You could sometimes use that attack boost to get Iron Head damage, which is good mixed damage against like a Clefable that's boosting Carmine with special defense, so having some physical damage is useful sometimes, but most of the time you just run this set with I've seen Fightinium Z, which gives you a huge focus blast Z move that hits him for huge damage and gives you a soul heart boost. You could also go Electrium Z for a big electric move. Farium Z, you could do whatever the hell you want. It's got Ice Beam for coverage. You could just cut this. Very customizable set. You have so many options. You go Hidden Power Fire for various steel types or whatever. Ferrothorn. And one of the most successful sets on this was also Calm Mind Pain Split. A bulkier sweeper, and it has some healing in the form of Pain Split with Farium Z to bypass the floor cannon, lowering your special attack. The Z move won't do that, but it'll scale really well from the base power and just destroy something. Also gaining you a soul heart boost. Ridiculous Pokemon, can I say? This Pokemon has it all. It has everything on the planet. From every generation onwards, this thing would be banned. In Gen 8 and 9, it's banned because it is simply too overwhelming. Too much set variety, too much sheer power, too much brute force. I suppose in Gen 7, though, it's a bit of a broken checks broken situation where Magearna is a solid check to the Tapu Lele Psychic spam stuff and the Ash Greninja Dark Pulse spam thing as well with the Assault Vest set. So it offers a lot defensively. So if you take Magearna out, suddenly Tapu Lele is broken and all this stuff. I don't know. It's a bit of a... It's one of those walking on a tightrope situations, but yeah, just one of the best competitive Pokemon ever. It's OU standards, and it's even great in Ubers. I played a lot of Gen 7 Ubers, and Magearna was a staple up there, which tells you a lot that an OU Pokemon is insanely common in Ubers. Because it could answer Xerneas, which previously was a little bit hard to check in Gen 6, but Gen 7, new amazing Xerneas check, Magearna. And it checked Yveltal, because of Dark Resistance, and Yveltal doesn't have great coverage for you. It also can pivot, it has like Heal Bell for useful utility. It's a good Heart Swap, which is another thing you can do in OU sometimes, but Heart Swap. Swaps all stat changes with target. Different from Psych Up, which copies their stat changes. Heart Swap swaps them, so you get all the boosts and they lose all the boosts. That is insane against Geomancy, Xerneas, and Ubers, who click Geomancy, you go Magearna, you live anything they do, and then you just take their boosts and it's over. Now you're the Geomancy guy. You have a Geomancy boost on you. So that's insane in Ubers. And it comes up in OU sometimes too. Yeah. Really, really powerful Pokemon here. Tapu Koko, also a staple, and all these Tapus have a fairy typing. That's their common theme, or one of the common themes. The other common theme they have is setting certain types of terrain on the field on switch-in. And Tapu Koko sets electric terrain, which is really, really strong, boosting electric type moves and also granting everything an immunity to sleep, which is very useful. Tapu Koko is pretty much the reason that sleep kind of sucks in this generation. It's why you never really see Breloom anymore, because it's pretty risky to just use a sleep setter when there is such a common, prevalent, powerful Pokemon that just by proxy grants a sleep immunity. Not even the main thing it's doing, but just an extra benefit of the Pokemon. So yeah, that's incredible. What's interesting about Tapu Koko is that it has a higher attack stat than special attack, but its physical attacking options are a little limited. Its best stab is Wild Charge, which has recoil. Doesn't have great coverage. The most noteworthy is Brave Bird, which also has recoil. So there's a bit of a cost to using its better attack stat, but 95 special attack, along with the benefit of Electric Surge, is good enough for this to be just a special attacker, which is more commonly seen as, with choice specs being a popular choice. It has really, really high speed, that good old Jolteon speed tier, the 130. This feels like modern Jolteon, and fairy typing seriously comes in handy on something so fast and pretty frail. It gives you entry points. You get useful resistances and immunities. Just having a Tapu Koko on your team, just having a fairy type on your team makes them wary to ever click a dragon move. Because if they click a dragon move and you go to Tapu Koko, such a momentum loss. They get nothing, and you have your powerful guy in that is probably threatening to KO them. And what switches in? Not much, because you have HP Ice to hit an incoming ground type if you predict correctly. And often when Tapu Koko eliminates the enemy ground type, they're just off to the races with these electric terrain boosted Thunderbolts and Volt switches that are just impossible to switch in against sometimes. Even if you have an electric resist, Volt switch is just going to chip you down, weigh you down, you're getting more threats in. It's momentum after momentum. This was the most popular set, I feel like, is kind of the quintessential Tapu Koko, but a lot of set variety on this guy. You could run Z-Move with a physical attack, which does bypass the recoil, because Z-Moves do not have recoil. U-turn also hits hard, and it's more of a mixed set here with HP Ice, which makes sense to hit the Lander T and the Garchomp. Calm Mind is another thing you could do with a Fairy Z move or Electric Z move you could do too. It's got Roost on it. That's fun. I suppose this is a set too. Shuka Berry, live an incoming ground type attack and counter attack with HP Ice. Could be good to eliminate a Choice Scarf Landorus Therian that thinks they've gotcha. Unexpectedly live the Earthquake and eliminate them. Now their main defensive pivot guy is gone. That's quite good. You can even Roost up afterwards. They thought of everything with this one. They thought of it all. Tapu Bulu is my personal favorite of the Tapus. It's a grass fairy type, and it sets grassy terrain on the field, which is interesting. Buffing grass type damage, also giving everything on the field chip heal if it's grounded, which does have some cool applications. You can give your team a little bit more healing. Also effectively have leftovers on top of a choice band, which is kind of nice. You give the enemy leftovers too, but if they're just dying to your big wood hammer, that doesn't really matter, does it? And Tapu Bulu is more of a wall breaker Pokemon with really high attack, solid bulk too, but lower speed than some of the other Tapus and other offensive threats. But just an insanely hard hitting stab wood hammer, which has recoil, but the sheer power of this is really worthwhile. Has a lot of good coverage too. Stone Edge covers flying types, which are a common switch-in against grass, like Zapdos and Tornadus Therian, Pokemon like that. Horn Leech is another alternative if you want something without recoil that still hits hard and also heals you a bit to give you a bit more longevity while you're wall breaking. Superpower, obviously good coverage too. Doesn't really run a fairy type attack, not too useful on it, but the fairy typing has great defensive benefit, of course. Tapu Bulu had a lot of synergistic value, because another benefit of grassy terrain is that it nerfs the damage of Earthquake by half. Just Earthquake, not ground type attacks. Specifically Earthquake is nerfed. And that's the most common ground type attack, so that's good enough often. And really nice in a world where Landorus, Therian, and Garchomp are prominent and common threats, as well as just ground coverage being common on any physical threat that can get it. So Tapu Bulu and Heatran was a common combo because you severely neuter the damage of Earthquake, the most common ground type attack, making Heatran able to actually live Earthquake, despite its 4 times ground weakness. And that synergizes with anything weak to ground, really. Heatran was a common one, but yeah, anything weak to ground appreciates Tapu Bulu as a teammate. And another common combo was Tapu Bulu and Katana. Katana, another grass-type physical wall breaker that really appreciates, obviously, having grassy terrain to boost its damage further. All of the other Tapus are quite aggressive Pokemon, but Tapu Fini is the defensive one. And this was a really, really common utility Pokemon that was seen all the time in Gen 7 OU. Really good defensive stance, Water Fairy, really excellent defensive typing. 2 of the best types combined. Is just always going to be a great combo. You got good stab options, and you also have the utility of Defog to remove hazards. But what really makes Tapu Fini great is the ability Misty Surge, which sets Misty Terrain in the field. Misty Terrain does not buff the damage of any of your attacks like the other terrains, but it grants a status immunity to everything. All status ailments do nothing. Now the enemy gets this benefit too, but this is really good because you're not worried about getting Scald burned on the way in, you're not worried about Toxic, and you can shield your teammates from the very same ailments. So that is the chief benefit of using Tapu Fini on your team, as is the utility of Defog. It also hits hard as well. 95 special attack, not bad for something so defensively oriented. And you could go in a more aggressive direction with Tapu Fini. It gets Calm Mind, so you could be a sweeper with Tapu Fini. Taunt gives you a bit of momentum and disruption as well. Does it get Draining Kiss? No. That would be good if it did. Maybe in another life. You may be asking, why would you use Scald on Tapu Fini when it creates Misty Terrain anyway and the opponent can't get burned? Well, flying type Pokemon and levitating Pokemon could still get burned, which has some application against like a Landorus Therian or Tornadus Therian. Zapdos was a common switch into Tapu Fini. So the added damage benefit of Surf is not actually that much. So Scald is only 10 power weaker with the ability to still burn some things. It may seem weird, but this does come up quite a bit. So yeah. You may be wondering why I'm not talking about Primarina in the Gen 7 section. Wait a bit and I'll be talking about Primarina in the near future, in a later generation, when this Pokemon had a bit of a resurgence, because this wasn't the best in its debut game, outclassed by Tapu Fini. But it would have its moment in the future. Tapu Lele, perhaps the most infamous wall breaker of Gen 7 OU. The king of ignorance. Click Psychic and resistances be damned. This choice specs Tapu Lele was a monstrous breaker with Psychic Terrain. Psychic Fairy, pretty nice typing. Times 4 fighting resistance, you cancel out your dark weakness with a neutrality, and Psychic typing is often a detriment, but with the Psychic Terrain, you really want Psychic Stab, obviously, so it comes in handy in this case. And Fairy typing provides valuable Moonblast Stab as well as defensive merit. I mean, Psychic on its own just doesn't cut it anymore. With Dark Weakness, Bug Weakness, and no great resistances in this world, but Fairy really makes you so much better defensively. Neutral to Bug now, neutral to Dark now. Psychic Terrain has an interesting effect, where it not only buffs Psychic type damage by 1.5 times, also makes you immune to priority moves, makes everything on the field grounded, immune to priority moves. And this is something you could build the teams around. Psychic Terrain offense teams were a thing, because certain Pokemon are really vulnerable to priority, fast, frail offensive threats, especially things with Shell Smash that are vulnerable to like a Sucker Punch, finishing them off, preventing them from sweeping, or a Shadow Sneak or an Aqua Jet, whatever it may be. But Psychic Terrain granting that priority immunity helps Tapu Lele out. You're not worried about a Bullet Punch from Scizor, which could get you. You're not worried about Azumarill Aqua Jet or Crawdaunt Aqua Jet or anything like that. It has a lot of offensive benefit. Really, really good effect on an aggressive Pokemon like Tapu Lele. Alolan Ninetales was introduced in Gen 7, an alternative form for Ninetales, with an Ice Fairy type combination instead of a Fire type. Much better, to be honest. Has the ability Snow Warning as a foil to the regular Ninetales, which has Drought to create Sun. This one creates Hail, which would later become Snow, and that's really good. Can benefit from Aurora Veil, an accurate Blizzard as well, and this is a pretty great offense enabler. Aurora Veil is basically Light Screen and Reflect in one, only requiring one turn to create such a thing, but it only works in Hail. But of course, since you create Hail, you can just use this instantly. Freeze Dry, an all-new Ice type attack in Gen 7 that actually super effective against water instead of being resistant. It has a power detriment. It's not as powerful as Ice Beam with only 70 base power, but no longer worrying about water types that resist you is enormous. And you even get Hypnosis for a bit of disruption on top of all this. So this can be a great offense enabler. Light Clay works with Aurora Veil to extend the turns and enable teammates to boost up. UUBL ranked in Gen 7, but certainly relevant as an offensive Pokemon and offense enabler. And once again, Fairy is really complementing an otherwise terrible mono type of Ice. Ice infamous for having so many defensive disadvantages, but Fairy gives you a little bit of life in that department. If this was a mono Ice type, it would be significantly harder to actually live random hits and, you know, hit the field ever. The Fairy typing just doing a lot of heavy lifting for this Pokemon for sure. I think that Mimikyu is noteworthy. Another new Fairy type in Gen 7. It's ranked in UU, but I saw it sometimes in OU. It's a Ghost Fairy type, which is really good. Not the best stats-wise, regrettably, but it has a really good ability. Disguise. It's kind of like a free substitute. The first hit that you take deals 0 damage to you and then breaks your disguise. It's kind of like having a free substitute in front of you, obviously allowing you a free turn to set up Swords Dance, which can have some aggressive merit, and you have the great Ghost and Fairy Stab combination, along with Stab Shadow Snake for priority. I used this quite a bit in Gen 7 on an aggressive team. In the early metagame, probably in the modern metagame, this would not hold up to scrutiny, but it had a little bit of relevance in OU. For a time, I remember seeing it every so often when Gen 7 was current. Probably a bit of a gimmick, not the most consistent thing in the world. Its stats are not the best, and Tapu Lele's everywhere, making the Shadow Sneak not super reliable, so that's a thing to consider. But a pretty cool Pokemon design in my opinion. I like Mimikyu. And Rabombi also exists, a Bug Fairy type, which once again is way better than just a mono Bug type. Fairy can make a terrible type good just by being there, truly. And Rabombi is interesting because it's a fast, sticky web setter. That's its real claim to fame. Ranked in RU only, not a great rank, but has the niche value in OU of being a pretty reliable sticky web setter. There are alternatives to Rabombi, like Shuckle is probably the most consistent one. It's bulky, it has sturdy to live incoming hits. You can chuck a Mental Herb on it for taunt as well. And it also has Stealth Rock and Encore for a bit of disruption to get the ball rolling offensively. I think Shuckle is probably the best sticky web setter because it also has rocks and all those benefits. There's also Smeargle, who can Spore, but Spore is not the best in this metagame with Tapu Koko. So Rabombi probably the second best in my eyes, but sometimes it is more desirable desirable than Shuckle because it's an aggressive threat too. It's actually quite fast and it has Stab Moonblast. It gets Stun Spore too, that does come up. And it can just set Sticky Web against a lot of leads because of how fast it is. And with the Focus Sash, you don't have to worry too much about incoming hits. So yeah, this is quite good. And this would be better in Gen 9. In Gen 9 OU, Ribombee was even ranked OU for quite a while when Sticky Web was at its prime, at its peak power. I think the Ribombee fell only just recently in July. I think Sticky Web is just petering out in popularity. But Ribombee is the best Sticky Web setter in Gen 9 with a lot of benefits like hitting Great Tusk super effectively and stuff. Zacian Crowned was released in Generation 8, and this is one of the strongest Pokemon ever made. Certainly the strongest fairy type of all time, with very few Pokemon that are actually anywhere near as powerful. This guy is ridiculous. They gave this everything. Fairy Steel is an outstanding type combination offensively and defensively. The ability to Intrepid Sword is frankly stupid, granting a +1 attack raise at all times. Whether you're up, down, left, or right, you have one attack stage to your name. And they also gave it a lot of stats. 170 base attack, boosted further by Intrepid Sword. Just have it all. And it's got good defenses too. I thought when something is fast, has high attack and speed, you're supposed to make it frail or give it a bad typing or something. They gave this the best defensive typing ever. They gave it the best defensive stats ever. And it's high speed and it has high attack and it gets an attack boost too. And why not also give it a good move pool? Swords Dance, Close Combat for coverage, Play Rough if you need stab. Need I say more? Need I say more, folks? Magearna was banned to Ubers in Gen 8, which is interesting because why would this be allowed in Gen 7 but banned in Gen 8, especially when Z moves no longer exist? It's kind of acting as a nerf to Magearna. I think that overall the power level decreased in Gen 8, which doesn't usually happen, but there were dex cuts in Gen 8, so powerful threats like Ash Greninja were no longer there anymore, and was overall a bit of a slower paced, more balance oriented metagame where Gen 7 had a lot of hyper offense and just explosive threats with Z moves to snowball out of control further. So that's worth considering, that the overall power level around Magearna lowered, but Magearna stayed pretty consistent. Magearna didn't even always need to use Z moves to be effective. There are plenty of sets that didn't need them. And I think that without all of the other powerful threats of Gen 7 and enemy Z moves to worry about, Magearna felt like a Gen 7 level Pokemon in Gen 8, if that made sense. And it was just too overwhelming to deal with. The Shift Gear set having such snowball potential with Soul Heart, all of its coverage being a little bit difficult to manage. We don't have any new OU ranked fairy types in Gen 8, just old stuff. Clefable and the Tapus are here, as is tradition. And Ninetales Alola became a bit better in this generation too, with more Pokemon that benefit from Hail and just being a better enabler. Unfortunately, Tapu Bulu did drop, regrettably, outclassed by the all-new Rillaboom, who was much better as a grassy terrain setter with a new move, Grassy Glide, which is broken. Sorry, Tapu Bulu fans. Big Monkey has outclassed you. The most noteworthy competitive fairy type introduced in Gen 8 was probably Hatterene here, who is not OU ranked, but does have some OU relevance. I believe it was OU by usage in the past, to be filled down over time. The addition of Melmetal to the metagame, probably not kind to Hatterene, but a solid Pokemon. It's a Psychic Fairy type once again, and it has Magic Bounce, which we've established is one of the best abilities in the entire game. And this Calm Mind Draining Kiss set is pretty nice. Draining Kiss is a fairy move with 75% recovery. Even though it only does 50 power, which is quite weak, healing kind of means you don't need a healing move, and you can attack and heal at the same time, which is useful to do two things at once. Mystical Fire is also a new attack a lot of fairy types got access to that lowers special attack by 1, allowing Hatterene to kind of just sit there and snowball. Can't be statused, can't be roared out. So this could be a good win condition sometimes. Definitely viable. It is unfortunate that you have that ghost weakness though, because Dragapult was very popular here, as was Melmetal that I just mentioned, who is a steel type, hitting you super effectively. Clefable will often have you beat as the bulky Calm Mind fairy type guy, so that's something to consider too. But Magic Bounce is cool to enable teammates that are weak to hazards if you don't want to run heavy duty boots all the time. You wanted like a choice band or choice specs on something weak to hazards. Hatterene can enable that quite well. Another thing that's noteworthy about Hatterene is that it's wearing a hat, which is kind of similar to me. I'm wearing a hat too. To be precise, it is the red vintage cap from JimothyCool.com, which you can check out. It's got a gaming koala, and it says "We're gaming folks" on it. And having a hat is a competitive advantage, as Hatterene shows us. So something to consider, I would say. Weezing Galar gets to have 2 hats, which I think is unfair. But A noteworthy fairy type. Are you ranked, regrettably? But I do remember this thing being semi-relevant in the early Gen 8 metagame when there were less options from DLC and whatnot, because it's pretty nice defensively with a poison fairy typing, which is interesting, a unique one, and defog being good utility, Will-O-Wisp being a status move that you can click if you want. Strange Steam is a unique fairy type attack that it has, with 90 power and a 20% confused chance. Not as good as Moonblast, but it's strange and interesting and unusual. I like Weezing Galar. I think it's funny. It's British Pokemon. It has 2 hats on. In Gen 9, one of the most noteworthy new fairy types is of course Iron Valiant, the new future form of Gardevoir/Gallade that is one of the most top tier offensive Pokemon in this format. Fairy Fighting is an outstanding type combination offensively and defensively. ×4 Dark Resistance, which comes up a lot in a world where Sucker Punch King Gambit is the king, and 2 great step types. Iron Valiant is an excellent mixed attacker with really high special attack and physical attack, and a fantastic speed stat too. It only grows higher when it consumes booster energy, which activates its Quark Drive ability a single time, which is the more prominent way to activate Quark Drive, since no good electric terrain setters are here. There's no Tapu Koko or anything like that. Iron Valiant can adapt to anything. In the early metagame, you would see a set that looks a bit like this usually, maybe Thunderbolt on it, a mixed attacking, fast threat, often a late game cleaner that comes in after spikes are set and everything's chipped, consumes that booster energy for the speed boost, and then just cleans up the game. Recently, I think that this is a more common set, a physically oriented one. Because of the rise of Galarian Slowking, you can knock that off and defeat it. Something like this is common too, with Moonblast for stab close combat being very complementary, hitting King Gambit, other steel types. Knock off, hitting Galarian Slowking, and Encore comes in handy a lot. As a way to defeat King Gambit, force them to remain clicking Swords Dance or Sucker Punch, leaving them totally vulnerable. Also good against just about any boost sweeper that you outrun, because you can just force them to repeat boosting, leaving them vulnerable to your attacks. It's easy to understand why this Pokemon is so good, despite some serious frailty on the defensive side. Stats-wise, this typing makes up for that immensely. A lot of entry points against Dragon-type attacks, Dark-type attacks, Fighting-type attacks, you name it. And it's very important in this metagame for a fast threat like this to be able to handle Sucker Punch, which you do naturally because of your typing. Remember Primarina, the Gen 7 starter-type Pokemon with a Water Fairy-type combination? An excellent-looking Pokemon in all regards, great typing, solid move pool, but it's always been outclassed by Tapu Fini, another Water Fairy type with similar benefits and a superior ability in the form of Misty Surge, which grants Misty Terrain. It's hard to justify using Primarina when Tapu Fini is right there, but now Tapu Fini is gone and Primarina is OU ranked. That's pretty good. It has flip turn since last generation, which wasn't too useful in Gen 8, or not enough to be great compared to Tapu Fini, but now a Water Fairy type pivot is wonderful. Water Fairy has a lot of defensive application against things like Dragapult, Samurott, Hisuian, Dark type threats, Dragon type threats, Fighting type threats. A lot of things you can come in on and then pivot out against with an Assault Vest enhancing your bulk. This is really nice. Psychic Noise is a new option you have access to, a psychic type attack that prevents the target from healing. And if you want, you can turn this into a water type attack with the Liquid Voice ability, which turns sound-based moves into water types. Kinda nice to just have this be your stab option, and then instead of running Surf, you can run some other move. Primarina can also be a Calm Mind sweeper with a set like this, and using Draining Kiss, much like Hatterene would use sometimes. And this can be a pretty nice win condition, actually. Healing and attacking at the same time with the Fairy type attack here. It's nice to see Primarina as a viable choice in OU after many generations of just being outclassed by Tapu Fini. Enamorus is an all-new option available from Legends Arceus since the Pokemon Home update that made all those Pokemon usable in Gen 9. And this is an interesting one, an all-new Genie, similar to Landorus and Tornadus and all those. Enamorus is a fairy flying type. You can probably imagine that that is a great typing. Enamorus has really nice mixed attacking stats, a decent speed. Not much bulk, but the value of that typing makes up for the defensive disadvantages here. And the ability Contrary is really interesting. This inverses your stat changes. It's a fantastic offensive ability. But Enamorus doesn't have that many ways to actually use this. The most notable in its base moveset is Superpower. It doesn't get Floor Cannon. That would be broken if it did, but it doesn't. But because this lowers attack and defense, it will instead raise attack and defense when used by Enamorus, which can be nice mixed coverage. But a more popular option is to actually use the Stellar Terra type, which is a unique Gen 9 mechanic. It is not actually a new type with defensive or offensive properties. The Stellar type is interesting. It is basically just an offensive buff. When you terrestrialize into the Stellar type, you keep all the same defensive properties you used to have, but you now have a little bit of a damage buff to all your moves, I think 1.2 times.
and stellar type attacks are neutral against everything, but super effective against enemies that have terastallized, no matter what type they are. So that can be pretty useful against defensive enemies that use water or fairy terror types to their advantage. What's interesting about Stellar Terror Blast is that Stellar type Terror Blast lowers your attack and special attack. With contrary, that inverts, so you gain attack and special attack instead. So Enamorus can Terra Stellar and have this really strong neutral attacking move that also ramps it up, and it gains attack and special attack every time it clicks, which is a bit like a Moxie Choice Scarf cleaner. You chuck a Choice Scarf on it. You have to spend your Terror to do this, but it can be very worthwhile as you snowball and snowball, constantly gaining special attack and just defeating everything. Similar vibe to like a Superior with Leaf Storm or something, with a Choice Scarf, and the fact that it's neutral does everything makes it pretty consistent. There's a lot of commitment involved in that, but can be useful nonetheless. Hatterene is OU now, and there's a few reasons for this. Magic Bounce to support rock weak allies feels more useful now, particularly because of the rise of Sun. Sun teams became much better because of the Protosynthesis Pokemon, the past Paradox Pokemon like Great Tusk, Raging Bolt, and all them. And they tend to be vulnerable to hazards, especially Torkoal itself. You don't want to run Boots on Torkoal. You want it to have Heat Rock to amplify Sun further. So Hatterene works, supporting teammates like Gouging Fire, any other fire type you might want, and Torkoal, shielding them from hazards a little bit. It can come in and prevent Stealth Rock from being set, bouncing it back to the enemy. And an aggressive set that you might see on Hatterene is with Eject button. When you get hit, you pivot out instantly. Can be nice to leverage the defensive switch into momentum. It makes sense to take a more aggressive and aggro approach with Hatterene on a Sun team, which tends to be an aggressive team style. That's why you have a Healing Wish to sacrifice yourself, pivot into something and heal it back, which is a great concept on aggressive teams. Hatterene can also operate defensively though with a Calm Mind set. Although you generally don't want to lose fairy typing, it can be nice to just become a water type with Hatterene, using Terastallization to get rid of the fairy type weaknesses, allowing you a free turn for an extra Calm Mind, Draining Kiss, etc. You also have that Psychic typing on you, which can be a liability, giving you Ghost Weakness, which is a common offensive type with Goldengo and Dragapult existing in the tier. So becoming Water type sidesteps that a little bit. Comfey has had a bit of a resurgence. This is a Gen 7 Mono Fairy type. That is pretty interesting. Underwhelming stats, of course. But we know that Fairy typing is great, and so is this ability, Triage. This Pokemon's healing moves have their priority increased by 3. Priority on your healing moves. Comfey is the only Pokemon that gets this ability, and it is a really, really good ability. And you can actually have a priority Draining Kiss, because Draining Kiss is a healing move. Healing moves include something like Synthesis, which heals you directly, but also Draining Kiss, which heals you from the damage dealt. So, think about the offensive merit of something like this. You can Calm Mind boost with it. This one's running a Grassy Seed, which can work alongside Rillaboom for that temporary defensive boost as you come in. Stored power makes sense there, because you get a defense boost buffing the power, as does Calm Mind. And priority boosted Draining Kiss. I mean, that's great into like Dragapult. You're faster than it thanks to your priority. It's great into Weavile or something. Weavile can't get you. You hit him with the priority fairy type attack. It's very interesting. I believe some OU teams have had great success with Comfey, and it's ranked UU, which is quite respectable. Grimmsnarl exists. Forgive me, I forgot to talk about this guy in my Dark type video. I suppose he's forgettable. Weird gremlin. Grimmsnarl is a hyper offense enabler that has Light Screen Reflect with priority from Prankster. Also has Parting Shot as a priority pivot move that also lowers attack and special attack. This thing was insanely dominant in the early Gen 9 metagame when it was all about boost sweepers, and there were way more powerful boost sweepers available, like Palafin for a time, and Annihilate, and all of these crazy Pokemon, Volcarona, etc. Grimmsnarl is insanely ranked in PU now. Quite a drop-off. This was OU Menace for a bit, now PU ranked. I think a big part of this is that it's been outclassed by better screen setters. We have Ninetales Alola, who sets Aurora Veil on the field. Generally a little bit better. It's also worth considering that since Dark types are immune to Prankster, you cannot pivot out against enemies like Kingambit and Tinglu, which can actually be a point of weakness for Grimmsnarl. And there's even more screen setters that have taken Grimmsnarl's job. Dragapult can use screens on it and has a bit more value because Dragapult has multiple sets that it could have, meaning it's not super telegraphed that you're gonna have screens on it. They might expect Will-O-Wisp or Specs, and then you surprise them with screens, whereas Grimmsnarl is one-dimensional. It's just screen setting, so the enemy can prepare for it instantly. on turn 1, and they probably have a good answer to it or some way to prevent it from getting out of control. So that is worth noting. Deoxys Spade also exists, who has Light Screen and Reflect now, and is allowed in OU. So Grimmsnarl has its work cut out for it with a lot of competition. And here we are, folks. We have made it to the end of the week. We have logged off our computers. And here is Tinkaton, the final fairy type I will talk about today. I like this Pokemon. It's a Steel Fairy type with a modest stat distribution. Nothing too crazy. They really had some restraint here. It has some good abilities. It's got Mold Breaker, which is probably the most popular ability on it, allowing it to ignore the effects of enemy abilities, so it can Stealth Rock against Magic Bounce. It can use Earthquake against Levitators and stuff like this, ignoring whatever the effect of the enemy ability may be. In the early metagame, Chien Pao was running rampant, and this was actually kind of a nice answer to it. It resists both of Chien Pao's stab types, being Dark and Ice, and it's at least neutral to Sacred Sword, the popular coverage option on Chien Pao. On top of this, it can Stealth Rock in the face of the common teammate Hatterene, who would commonly be used to shield Chien Pao from Stealth Rock, since it's an Ice type, and it can hit Chien Pao really hard with either Play Rough or Gigaton Hammer for stab. Speaking of Gigaton Hammer, that is the signature move on this Pokemon, a 160 power Steel type attack that can't be used twice in a row, which is interesting. I kind of like this, because it's a way to deal a lot of damage with Tinkaton, making up for its low attack stat, and it has that downside of not being spammable. I think this is a rare instance of a massive base power move that is quite well designed and reasonable in my opinion. And Knockoff is great utility. Early metagame, Knockoff was way less common. And it's still uncommon. It's still seriously cut in its distribution, which I think is a good thing that Gen 9 did, because Knockoff was a problem for a bit. But Tinkaton was one of the few things in the early metagame that did get Knockoff, which made it pretty worthwhile. Actually, it's not ranked OU. It's not quite that good, but it still props up sometimes, and a recent development was actually to use the alternative ability on Tinkaton, Pickpocket, which, if you're hit by a contact move, you will steal the attacker's item. And that has an interesting synergy with Air Balloon, because this is a consumable item, not only granting you a temporary immunity to ground type attacks, but when it's popped, you no longer have an item, and Pickpocket will activate, stealing the enemy's item for yourself. So you get like a little bit of extra value out of Air Balloon before it pops, and then you get another item, and you steal the enemy's item. A bit of utility there. And this is actually decent. I mean, Knockoff is always good. Encore has its applications against King Gambit and other boost sweepers. Ice coverage can check things like a Dragonite. I have said that this is one of the better Pokemon designs from Gen 9. I think it has a really cool combination of traits, a good move pool, and a good typing that doesn't feel too broken like Magearna, because its stats aren't also stupid. Like Magearna, I would say, is a poorly designed Pokemon, because they gave it too many things. Like, it has great typing, great ability, and great stats, and great move pool. You can't just have everything. You gotta have some pros and cons, right? But Tinkaton, I think, like, it has some OU relevance here and there, despite being pretty weak stats-wise, which I think speaks to being a well-designed Pokemon, because it can fill certain niches that other Pokemon can't, because it's actually got a unique combination of traits that nothing else can fill. This Pickpocket thing is a cool development, and the times when it rose up as a little bit of a response to Chien Pao were also interesting, and it has those powerful moveset options, but it doesn't feel too overwhelming or annoying as an abuser of those options, because its stats are reasonable. I'm a fan of Tinkaton, and it's got a big hammer, which I consider to be a little bit funny. And there we have it, folks. Fairy types in competitive Pokemon. An overpowered type, many would say. A lot of advantages, and the weaknesses are manageable. 2 weaknesses to uncommon types makes it great neutrally against everything. Offensively, hits 3 really common types super effectively. A lot of types will use fairy coverage, even if they're not fairy type, which speaks to the power of it offensively. A lot of people suggest that they could nerf fairy type, maybe make bug effective against fairy or something. I think having an OP type is okay as long as you balance the Pokemon that you give fairy type. It's always bad when a Pokemon has fairy type and then they have a lot of other advantages too, like Magearna. Like, they went too far with that one. But what do you think, folks? Is fairy too powerful? Is it okay, actually? And who is your favorite fairy type in the game? I might say Tinkaton is mine. I really like Tinkaton. But what about you folks? Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you later.